In the early decades of the 19th century, the United States found itself at a crossroads, a nation grappling with its identity and its ambitions. The period between 1830 and 1861 was marked by significant upheaval, particularly concerning the indigenous peoples of the eastern United States. This era was characterized by a concerted effort by the federal government to civilize indigenous tribes and, ultimately, to remove them from their ancestral lands. The policies and actions taken during this time were deeply rooted in a combination of economic interests, racial ideologies, and a fervent belief in manifest destiny, the idea that the expansion of the United States across the American continent was both justified and inevitable. At the heart of this civilizing mission was President George Washington's vision for indigenous peoples. Washington believed in the potential for Native Americans to assimilate into Euro-American culture. He envisioned a future where indigenous tribes would adopt agriculture, Christianity, and European-style governance. Washington's approach was predicated on the belief that by civilizing indigenous peoples, they could be integrated into American society, thus reducing conflict over land and resources. However, this vision was inherently paternalistic and rooted in a Eurocentric worldview that regarded indigenous cultures as inferior. Washington's policies laid the groundwork for a broader governmental approach, one that would evolve dramatically over the following decades. Fast forward to the presidency of Andrew Jackson, a figure whose legacy is irrevocably tied to the forced removal of indigenous peoples from their homelands. Jackson's administration marked a significant shift from Washington's assimilationist policies to a more aggressive stance that prioritized land acquisition for white settlers. Jackson's belief in the superiority of the American way of life fueled his determination to relocate Eastern tribes, particularly the Cherokee and the Seminole, to lands west of the Mississippi River. This was framed as a benevolent act, a way to protect indigenous peoples from the encroaching tide of settlers and the inevitable violence that would ensue from their presence. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 was the legislative embodiment of Jackson's vision. This act authorized the federal government to negotiate treaties that would exchange indigenous lands in the East for territory in the West. The act was met with resistance, particularly from the Cherokee Nation, who had adopted many aspects of Euro-American culture, including a written language and a constitution. The Cherokee fought back, taking their case to the Supreme Court in a series of legal battles that culminated in Worcester versus Georgia. The court ruled in favor of the Cherokee, affirming their sovereignty and the illegality of Georgia's attempts to seize their lands. However, Jackson famously ignored the ruling, reportedly saying, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." This disregard for the judiciary exemplified the lengths to which Jackson would go to achieve his goals. The consequences of the Indian Removal Act were dire. Thousands of indigenous people were forcibly removed from their homes, facing treacherous journeys and unimaginable hardships. The Cherokee, for instance, were subjected to what is now known as the Trail of Tears, a forced march that resulted in the deaths of thousands due to disease, exposure, and starvation. The Seminole, too, faced brutal conflicts in their resistance to removal, leading to the Second Seminole War, which lasted from 1835 to 1842. The conflict resulted in significant loss of life and resources for both the Seminole and the U.S. military. Ultimately, the U.S. government was able to relocate many Seminole, but a small group remained in Florida, continuing to resist removal. By the time of the Indian Removal Act, the estimated number of indigenous people forcibly relocated was staggering. It is believed that tens of thousands of Cherokee alone were removed from their ancestral lands, with estimates ranging from 15,000 to 20,000. The Seminole experienced similar fates, with thousands displaced during the conflicts surrounding their removal. The government's actions were justified under the guise of progress and civilization, yet they were rooted in a desire to open up land for white settlers, who were eager to cultivate the fertile lands of the Great Plains. The Great Plains, at the time, were perceived as a vast, untamed wilderness, a region ripe for settlement and agricultural development. However, this perception belied the complex ecosystems and the indigenous peoples who had lived in harmony with the land for generations. The plains were viewed by many settlers as a blank slate, a place where they could start anew, free from the constraints of Eastern society. Yet the reality was that the removal of indigenous peoples from these lands was not simply a matter of relocating populations. It was an act of cultural erasure, a violent severing of the ties that indigenous communities had with their land, their history, and their identity. As the United States expanded westward, the ideological justifications for these actions became increasingly entrenched. The belief that indigenous peoples were savages who needed to be controlled or removed was widespread among many white Americans. This dehumanization facilitated the acceptance of policies that would have been unthinkable under different circumstances. The narratives of progress and civilization were used to mask the brutality of these actions, allowing the nation to reconcile its ideals of liberty and justice with the reality of its treatment of indigenous peoples. In conclusion, the period from 1830 to 1861 was a pivotal chapter in American history, marked by a tragic intersection of ambition, ideology, and violence. The removal of indigenous peoples from the eastern United States was not merely a series of policy decisions, but a profound moral failing that reverberates through history. As we reflect on this era, it is crucial to acknowledge the resilience of indigenous communities and their ongoing struggles for recognition, rights, and justice in the face of a legacy that sought to erase their existence. Understanding this history is not just an academic exercise. It is essential for fostering a more equitable and just society today.